How can we make the economy work for everyone? This is Westminster Reimagined. Now, Armando, the UK is a really unequal country. The income gap in the UK is the largest it's been in 10 years. So now we live in a world where food bank use has almost doubled since 2014. Yeah. Nearly a third of low-income families are unable to heat their home. Meanwhile, the richest 1% of households in the UK are worth around £3.6 million each. So that tells you that something's broken.
Something is broken, and as you're saying, it's getting worse. And it's an issue, I think, that's just driven the last... the last year of politics has not been about, yes, there's been a war in Ukraine, yes, there's been the pandemic, but I think beneath it all is this, the impending, not the impending food crisis, the current food crisis, the current energy crisis, the spending crisis, and an awareness, I think, now across all parties that there is a huge crisis of inequality that has to be dealt with. When we started, we've been recording these podcasts over a period of time. When we started out, we didn't know who the next Prime Minister was going to be. We're now, as we're recording this one, we're now in a case where the solution to inequality is trickle-down economics. And I think I'm not the only one who's just thought, if someone says to you, I'm really hungry, you don't say, well, in about 3 or 4 years' time, if we go for growth, there'll be a period where there'll be a greater investment in infrastructure that will consequentially benefit. You say, would you like something to eat? Yeah. If politics is about anything, it's about how do we survive? How do we get through the day, really? And I think this is an issue that's frustrated, annoyed, angered everyone, perplexed everyone. But what these podcasts are about are talking to people who hopefully are able to provide us with an insight into where there are solutions, really.
Now, we're joined by 2 special guests to help us explore this issue. Dominic Watters is a social worker and campaigner against food insecurity. And Adrienne Buller is the Director of Research at Commonwealth, a progressive think tank focused on building a democratic economy. Welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Dominic, I want to start with you because you have sort of gone on a journey in recent months, really, from sort of trying to live and survive and get a job, training to be a social worker, and now you've got a job in that sector, and raising awareness of how difficult it's been to even afford food for you and your daughter at times. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience and also why you've decided to try and bring it into the public sphere?
So I'm a single dad. I live in a council estate block in the Garden of England in Kent with my amazing daughter, and I've been on child benefit, universal credit, free school meals for my daughter, and the vouchers during the holidays, thanks to the work of Marcus Rashford and the Food Foundation. And also we've always had a pay-as-you-go gas and electric meter, which comes with its own lack of access to fuel, because the shop in my estate, so it only sells the lowest quality of food produce, and there's no facility to top up your gas and electric key. So that's why I note that it's both a food and a fuel desert in the Garden of England.
That draws on the point Anoosh was making right at the start, that we have so much wealth and resources, and yet somehow we're not able to draw on them.
Yeah,
right on your doorstep.
And I think it also speaks to barriers in the way of social mobility, and also the impact it has on your well-being and your ability to engage in society, because when your electric's on emergency, you don't want the fridge to run out in the middle of the night, then the freezer, all the food that you had for your child isn't going to be good probably by the morning. Can't have a shower, you can't boil your kettle, and especially when my daughter was younger and that happened unfortunately quite regularly, just to do with financial limitations. And it's fine saying, oh well, you should have planned for it, but if you just literally don't have the money, then no amount of planning is going to kind of...
And also once you're in the cycle of thinking just day by day, it's very difficult to... You can't pause that to think, oh, I'll strategize the next year.
Yeah.
You've just got the next 24 hours to negotiate, really.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's these kind of considerations I think our politicians, well, some of our politicians don't necessarily seem to understand. So you had Jake Berry, who is chair of the Conservative Party, recently saying, you know, if your fuel costs are going up, then just get a higher paid job, you know. And then you also have some MPs suggesting...
Well, that's what I've done. But...
Yeah. There we go, a vindication.
I'm yet to be paid. So just to say, I'm yet to be paid. And one of the holes in universal credit that there's many, it's a dehumanizing system, it's broken, and I will speak more about it. But one thing I just found out, so I just got a job, but obviously haven't been paid. I'm applying for the petrol help, travel to work help. She said, yeah, well, you have to supply this. I didn't have an email that I could show her then and there. And you get 25p a mile. I don't think that's in line with the cost of petrol.
Yeah.
So I think that needs to be reviewed, because if supposedly these state mechanisms are meant to be promoting people climbing the ladder or whatever, so to speak, that's not achieving that. And yeah, it's a struggle. Like, they haven't even responded to my request. So.
And when did you start? When did you make that decision to? When did you actually decide to go into social work to start the whole process of training?
It's quite a long story, but just in terms of social work, it was I didn't have the finances to do anything, and it was only when my daughter was older that I could start. Like, she's less dependent on me in secondary school, so I could start thinking about a career for me. Because before, like, I'd have to be at the primary school gates, so you couldn't really study, and especially when you're living in poverty, it's not like you got an au pair or things like that. Those sort of safety nets that other people with different statuses enjoy. But yeah, social work, I could get a bursary to study it, so that was just to be transparent about it. Like, that was one of the reasons. But I was always like silenced by snobbery. I wouldn't be able to have this conversation now 3-4 years ago, because of, I think people need to remember, food insecurity wasn't a term that was discussed. It wasn't in the public sphere, maybe in the US and Canada, but 3 years ago, before Marcus Rashford, it wasn't discussed. And that goes along with fuel poverty, which is something, unfortunately, I experience still. It's helped me, like, learn the language of how to express the inequalities that I experience as a single dad in poverty.
And you say it's like a kind of straitjacket. It's not just about not being able to afford certain things, but there's a psychological constraint put on you where you start you're made to feel less about yourself.
100%. Yeah. And it's where the impact is so, like, broad in terms of your ability to engage in society, sustain relationships, be confident in the world, and also your physical and mental just well-being. And when I was working with children in care, actually, I noticed, and this was just before COVID, but we hadn't heard of COVID then, like the beginning, I think, of 2020. I don't want to get the date wrong, and I noticed how the children in care I was working with as a student, social work student, just to let everyone know, you have to do placements. So my first placement was with children in care, and I saw how they had a lack of access to nutrition. And I would, as the social work student, I was often tasked with taking them to the local food bank. They relied on the food bank and like donations of like nearly past its sell-by date food from local businesses. And on a Thursday, we got a delivery from Greg's Bakery, and that was like the choice most wanted picks because you don't have to cook. You know, it was like the wanted food. And then, but I noticed how the key workers were using that food, the Greg's Bakery bits, as like a behaviour controlling mechanism. So if the children, if one of the residents or young people in care, if they'd gone against the rules of the scheme that week, like they'd come back past 10 or they'd, I don't know, done something else, then they weren't allowed access to that Greg's Bakery produce. And then when like I'd go home, I kind of like internalized how like I've faced the same lack of access to nutrition that the young people in care were experiencing. And I did a bit of research, and that's when I came across the concept of food insecurity and kind of why it so resonated with me and my daughter's situation. I've gone on to kind of highlight that I would strongly suggest, and through my experiences, even in professional spaces, the contempt towards a voice of poverty, even in a forward-thinking profession,
I mean, even
is there.
In the last week, we're recording this, it's sort of first couple of weeks in October, after the crash caused by Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. The next thing that was suggested was cuts to benefits, or not, as if the problem behind the economy was the welfare budget, and it absolutely infuriates me. This has been going for like 10, 20, 30 years. This natural default from economists and politicians to go towards the welfare sector rather than there's 10 times more business fraud than there is benefit fraud.
Yeah.
And yet 20 times even, I think. And yet you don't get politicians saying we must go after tax fraud and business fraud. There were billions written off in the loan scheme during COVID, loans to businesses that were fraudulent, but which the Treasury or Inland Revenue said we just can't get it back. And I just wonder if is there just a huge blindness or lack of awareness of how this is a mismatch of priorities, really,
I can't even be as generous as to say I think it's a lack of awareness. I think it's a very willful and deliberate blindness, right? And it's baked into every part of our system, right? So the healthiest type of food tends to be more expensive. You pay a penalty for having a prepaid meter of energy. Your unit cost tends to be higher than if you have a tariff. And so we've just, every possible system that supports the basics of life, we've baked in this kind of hostility towards poverty and hostility towards the working class. And no one bats an eye at the fact that, people working 40 hours a week still require benefits just to survive. That is not, this idea of people being like scroungers, which is despicable and absolutely untrue. That is fundamentally a problem with the system in which you live. If you can be working full-time, more than full-time, and still barely afford to live.
If it's okay to just say, it's like that is something that, and I'm really grateful for you both raising that, and it's something that I've tried to, with my writing and thinking, tried to look at, and it is this unfortunate element that I think we have in English, maybe I'm saying it wrong, British culture, but definitely English I can speak to, of this contempt and undeserving way of thinking about people that are poor. And it's okay.
As if it's their fault.
Yeah, it's okay for them to be hungry because they're poor.
Yes. Yes.
They're a single parent because they're poor, and it is something that needs to be discussed more. And I'm so grateful to be here to approach these sort of topics, because it's something that is so ingrained that it really does need combating on a lot of levels.
And are we being efficient with our resources in terms of, you've written that a lot of our energy, the national grid, for example, isn't actually ours.
No, the way that our energy system operates is like fundamentally irrational, right? So the UK really sets a global standard for just irrational privatization of all the systems that kind of support our ability to live. And energy is like really the top of the pile for that. So, every aspect of our energy system, from the way it's generated to how it's transmitted by the national grid, it's called the national grid. It's a publicly listed company with lots of international shareholders, to the suppliers, and kind of every element is privately owned, is, in theory meant to be regulated, but broadly is adding huge markups and costs at every stage that has, real impacts on people's lives. I mean, we've done a lot of research at Commonwealth on the energy system, and, between 2011 and 2010, the big six suppliers paid out, close to £23 billion in dividends to their shareholders, even as, energy prices consistently rose. And the same goes for the national grid, or this element that a lot of people don't think about or know of, which is the sort of more local distribution networks, they effectively get to operate as regulated monopolies, but they have the highest profit margin of any sector of the UK economy, not just the highest margins within the energy system, but the entire UK economy. We're talking profit margins north of 40%, and that's just charging people for ownership of an asset that used to be public. And so we've organized this entire system around profitability in a way that is clearly failing. As of September of this year, there were, I think, 11 million households reporting that they were behind on their bills, and 5 million reporting that they were skipping meals to pay for their energy bills. That is an indefensible system. We're not doing the basics in terms of just delivering the fundamentals of life to millions of people. I think, we need to be asking very serious questions.
Yeah, Dominic, you were saying you live in the Garden of England, and yet the food that you have access to is like always the low quality.
Lowest quality.
Yeah.
And just on the fuel thing, so it's been spoken about quite widely that people who are often the most disadvantaged and vulnerable families in society are on pay-as-you-go gas and electric. We were told by the government, and I got a letter from, and I will name them if it's okay, because they're not treating their customers
can't afford
well.
lawyers, so...
Okay, I won't.
No, go.
But I got a
Go ahead.
letter saying, and it was in the press and everything, it's widely being spoken about, that we'd get a voucher on or about the 1st of October to help, to top up your gas and electric. Still hasn't arrived. And what are we, the 12th or mid-October?
And it's getting colder.
Yeah, and so I think... The fact that these issues aren't more broadly spoken about, it kind of resonates with those points around an approach to poor people as being undeserving, because that's a categorical error and failure.
Well, given we, to use that terrible phrase, we are where we are, and we have the government we have. If you had access to the government, what would you want to most persuade them about in terms of perception and priorities?
Trickle-down economics is a lie that never has worked and never will. I don't know. It seems a good place to start. Cutting corporation tax, has statistically no correlation with economic growth. There are huge studies of meta-analyses that basically show there's just no relationship between those things, and yet we're forging ahead as if that is inevitably going to be the case. The same goes for cutting taxes on the wealthiest. That does nothing to sort of build a more kind of thriving economy. The UK, even before this package, had some of the kind of lowest tax rates for corporations within the OECD, and despite that, some of the lowest rates of business investment, some of the most kind of stagnating wages, and so all the evidence is sort of there in front of us, and yet this government is continuing to cleave purely to ideology.
And given that we're in a kind of festival of U-turns at the moment, is there one thing specifically that you would want to persuade them to think again about?
Well, I think obviously the approach to, we've already had a U-turn on the 45% tax rate, but there are other kind of taxes such as a cut to dividend tax that they're still forging ahead with that will only benefit, the top 10% of UK households who will, surpass the threshold because shareholding is obviously hugely unequal. And also just kind of the litany of tax cuts or reversals of Sunak's plans to, e.g., raise corporation tax, all of that, I think, has punched this huge kind of hole in the public budgets that now is leading to, and this is the big fear of the moment, is, austerity round two for a system that's already on its knees. You have Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies yesterday, I think, coming out saying, we need £60 billion in spending cuts now. From where? And I think, that's an incredibly dangerous and frankly terrifying line that is now sort of setting up this new spending plan for absolutely decimating an already kind of vulnerable public sector.
And Dominic, if you had a day with a cabinet minister, what would you want to show them, tell them, implore them, or...
I've got a whole 24 hours.
You've got a whole 24
hours. I would want them to kind of recognise that poor people have been in a cost of living crisis long before the phrase was popularised, and that it's only now that these price rises are impacting, the middle and upper classes that is getting this sort of attention. I've got a campaign called Food is Care, and it's one of our objectives is, so my daughter's on free school meals. And there's great work being done by, at the moment, I think it's called Feed the Future, for free school meals to be extended to everyone on universal credit. But as someone whose child is actually on free school meals, they're not free. My daughter often texts me when she's at school saying, "Dad, I haven't got any money left on my thumb." So a kid gets £3 a day to spend on food and drink, as if they're on free school meals. So I wouldn't just say that they need to be extended. I would say that the amount each child is given a day is increased in line with inflation or the rising cost of food, because the amount of food you could get your child for £3 at the beginning of COVID isn't the same amount of food as you can get your kid today. And that also speaks to like the work of Marcus Rashford. It was amazing. Like we got vouchers, during the recent summer holidays and the Easter or whatever. But that works out at £2.14p a day for your kid when that's stretched over the week. And I hope you can imagine that doesn't feed your child nutritiously. And it also speaks to these the MP, I think his name was Lee Anderson, saying like you can feed your family for 30p. Like I can see on my gas and electric meter just to cook chicken, boil rice, pasta, whatever it is. And I like cooking for my amazing daughter, but it costs more than 30p just to do that, let alone the ingredients and the use of the food bank and my cooker from the local homeless charity. And, the windows that don't shut, you're putting your gas and electric on, the blocks in a bit of a mess, and, the bins outside that don't get collected and you can smell in the morning for weeks. So what would I do? I would get the MP. Was it an MP I get?
It was an MP.
Okay, I'll take it.
Or a government minister.
A government minister. I'd take him around my council estate, and then I don't know.
Cook them one of your amazing meals.
Yeah, to try and persuade
and
them
say
to
this
make
didn't cost 30p.
This cost £5.15. No, I'd probably do that.
Well, I really wanted to ask you a bit about that. These sort of the way that the government seems to get in the way of you trying to live your life. Because while they've deemed that bankers need uncapped bonuses to incentivise them to work harder, there was part of the mini budget that has gone quite uncovered, which was they're going to force some universal credit claimants to spend 6 hours longer a week actively job seeking or face sanctions. So why is it that, there are these cuts built into welfare and also these other punishments, like you were talking about, the school vouchers not going up with inflation, that actually get in the way of you living your life and doing your job rather than incentivising you to work harder?
Yeah.
Is that how it feels?
100%. And the challenges you have, and it, like, not just to speak personally and like how it impacts you, even when I started studying, so living in poverty as a single parent, like you'd feel like you couldn't even vocalize the struggles you were going through in your classroom. And the person next to you might have been going through similar things, but because of that impact, that the powers that be view you in a certain undeserving way, that it kind of silenced you. So definitely, like, snobbery has silenced the poor for too long. And in terms of time, I hear my neighbours speaking about, and some of my neighbours are perhaps older and less mobile than I am, which had a massive impact during COVID, and they could only use the shop in the estate. But they're like spend their day going to different supermarkets that maybe like have a special deal on this, I don't know, on rice or whatever it is, and and spend their time on the buses going to different ones for their tea or their milk or whatever it is. And it doesn't feel like I think it's the 6th richest country in the world that really people should be experiencing that sort of inequality.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because Adrienne, I saw you tweeting a piece from the FT that actually described Britain as a poor society, just with some very rich people living in it. Can you explain a bit about that vision of Britain? Because it's not, I think, how we like to see ourselves.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely not. And I think, when we use, statistics like we're the 6th wealthiest economy in the world, I think that we all use those, and it completely skirts over how profoundly unequal that distribution is, right? And so, yeah, I think it was just a perfect phrasing from John Byrne Murdoch of, a poor country broadly with living standards for the vast majority of the population that are below the average for, and I'll use this in scare quotes, the developed world, right? Far below what the average is for most of our kind of peer countries, whereas the top, 10% of our society is above average and having a grand old time. And I think, it's really important to focus on that distribution rather than the fact that, our GDP is a certain level. Because frankly, GDP doesn't mean anything until you know how it's distributed, until you know what it's producing, how is that delivering for, people's lives, for their well-being, for their health, for planetary health, etc. It just to focus on that figure obscures basically everything that matters.
And one of the trends I've noticed recently is that it's not the usual suspects who've been saying we've got to do something about this. It is now a lot of Tory backbenchers. It's the IMF of all people saying this budget is extraordinarily stupid. Have we reached the point where actually people are waking up to the fact that actually inequality is bad for an economy? That actually the more unequal a society is, the less that society can grow?
I mean, I hope so. I mean, there are some whisperings of that, I guess. The evidence that, lower levels of inequality are good for health, for productivity, for everything that sort of mainstream economists say they care about. That's years in the making. It's very clear. And I guess people, because conditions now are so extreme, are maybe beginning to awaken to that. I think it's a tragedy that conditions have to become as extreme as they are for this to be even on the table. But unfortunately, it feels as though the people who currently are pulling all the levers of power are sort of continuing to willfully ignore that case, right? This idea of, growing the pie as the objective. It doesn't really matter if you grow the pie if the people at the very top get even more of it, and you end up with less if you're at the bottom. So I think, unfortunately, people in power haven't yet.
Plus, you've got to be able to afford to cook that pie.
Well, exactly.
That's why I tweeted the other day, Liz Truss is so insensitive talking about growing a pie when, the poor don't have the money for the meat and veg or to top up the gas and cook it.
Yeah. We've painted a pretty kind of honest but bleak picture of where we are now. In the remaining time we have, are there any solutions, any suggestions, any positive ways out of this that we can suggest?
I'll just contextualize it. I was getting asked, I had a little bit of a very small platform, and I was getting asked to write little pieces for social work, blogs and stuff, and I was often getting asked to speak about my lived experience of poverty or council estates, or my lived experience of food insecurity. And I'll be sitting in my council flat and I'll be writing the blogs, and I'll be so grateful that, oh my God, someone wants to see my writing or whatever. But then I started thinking that this isn't my lived experience, this is my living experience. And that's a concept that I developed in my first book. Thank you for mentioning. And just to say that, so that brings me to what I would ask the government, or if we had the choice to, is that the government needs a poverty minister or department. They've got all these ministers for this, for that, but poverty has been neglected for so long, and I would suggest that it needs to be someone with living experience of poverty, so they can speak to the state mechanisms, and they've experienced how the intersecting inequalities from housing to food insecurity to fuel deserts to that could be like an integral part of forming approaches to policy. And if it's okay to say, with Food is Care, I want through my research, the idea of welfare and well-being, which well-being being in the Care Act, and welfare and well-being being in the Children's Act 1989, needs to be legally redefined to include food insecurity. And so achieving food security for the most disadvantaged would then have state duty to do that. So that's something I'm really trying to campaign
and it's pretty
on.
amazing that there's no state duty already to make sure that people can eat.
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
there's a sort of there's a sort of state duty to keep debt a kind of percentage of GDP. There's a state duty or there's a duty imposed on the Bank of England to keep inflation within us. But yeah, you're right. There isn't, something that's so consequential and has such a kind of pervasive effect on not just the economic health, but our general health.
Yeah.
There isn't actually a system in government that measures it and tries to identify whether we're actually reaching it or not.
And if we look at how we're protected through the Human Rights Act,
Yes.
we're protected from torture,
Yes.
we're protected from all these different things. You're not protected from poverty.
Yes.
And that's something that speaks to that kind of snobbery and idea of people being undeserving.
Yeah.
And have you detected any sort of positive signs in
Oh, sorry.
anything sort of in government or opposition? I suppose,
Always the question.
policies
Yeah.
coming out?
I mean, look, I think that there are a lot of kind of policy solutions that are just like floating around, whether that's proposals around a minimum income floor, so complete reform to the kind of benefit system we have to make sure that, at all times people have almost like a thermostat that goes up and down to make sure that you always have enough to live, or whether that's, a return of some kind of public ownership in the energy system. The kind of seeds of that are present in what came out of Great British Energy and the Labour Conference, although there's a lot more to that package, I think, that would be needed to really hit energy bills. There are all sorts of ideas floating around that do give me kind of inspiration and hope. What I would say is, it's unlikely that those things will be heard and realized until, we have people like Dominic kind of front and center, basically speaking about what it's actually like to be on the sharp end of those things. It's very easy, and I work in a think tank, I'm obviously guilty of this, it's very easy to drop big statistics and walk around with like, here's my great policy proposal, and for people to ignore that, right? Because, we're completely marginalizing the just harsh reality of everyday life on the sharp end of, these very cruel systems. The other thing I would say that gives me actual kind of genuine hope broadly has been the kind of huge resurgence of the trade union movement in the UK over the past few months. And I think one of the biggest kind of strategic points for all of us who care about these issues is to be, unwaveringly supportive of, rank and file union membership, supportive of strikes, and to hugely resist as much as we can Truss's plans to basically kind of debilitate unions even further, whether that's, stricter rules around strike action, et cetera. That's something that needs to be, I think, strongly resisted, because union action benefits not just those in unions, but absolutely everybody else. It is one of those rare moments where it's a kind of lifts all boats phenomenon.
And I did want to ask you, because you hinted at it, whether or not a Labour government would be the answer. And I think we're allowed to talk about the prospects of a Labour government now, finally, that they're sort of 30 points ahead in some polls. But, they're talking a lot about growth. It was Keir Starmer who first said growth, growth, growth. And he started using the language of the magic money tree, which is, of course, what David Cameron and George Osborne used to accuse Labour of using when they were trying to make cuts to public spending. Is that just a sort of rhetorical stance, or, is it worrying that they are taking the conservative framing of the economy? Obviously, if they do get into power, they'll be inheriting some pretty tricky public finances.
Yeah, I do think that the adoption of the framing, not just around how the public finances work, but also a lot of the framings around benefits and around benefit fraud. The fact that that's being adopted by, MPs in the Labour Party, hugely problematic. Some of their framing around migrants, around the police crime and sentencing bill. I think there are lots of elements within the current Labour Party that are cause for concern. I do think, however, that there has been sort of a bit of a door opened with what came out of this Labour conference, where, for the first time we really heard some kind of policy vision. And I think things like Great British Energy or the National Wealth Fund, while kind of small on their own, have kind of created a wedge moment where we can really push on some of these issues, which I guess is encouraging. I try to be optimistic.
No, that's what we wanted. And Dominic, yeah. I'd love to have your views on the sort of politics of this. Do you look to an alternative party in government for help, or is it not how you see your experience?
I heard about like the Labour pushing more towards like public ownership and stuff, and I think that would be supportive of. But I was just thinking, it's probably a bit off topic, but around social work and, how social workers are, at the end of the day, they're an arm of the government, and our professional standards come from the Department for Education, Social Work England, and the British Association of Social Work. And at present, even though those... So just to share a vital statistic of a study by Professor Paul Bywaters is that you're 10 times more likely if you're living in a deprived area, to have a social worker involved in the raising of your child than if you live in the more affluent areas of our country. So just with that established, the social work professional standards and guidance, it gives a nod to poverty at present, but it doesn't include food insecurity or fuel poverty, which I would say speaks to like the distance that the people that make this guidance enjoy from the daily realities of poverty. So part of the work that I'm doing, and something I would suggest that the government could get behind, who knows, is that that food insecurity and the realities of that, and as we've spoken about, the impacts of that needs to be discussed and included in the professional standards for social workers, because just to re-highlight that, you know, social workers are tasked with dealing with some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So
again, it's the point of the distance between those who are trying to run things and trying to change things with the actual reality that someone like you has been shining a light on in this discussion. Yeah. Okay.
And the barriers I've met have been like, I don't know, there is a level of kind of like dismissing a voice from poverty that I've experienced that goes against, you know, professional values and ethics.
Yes, it's on the one hand they say, you know, everyone should have a right to this. Everyone should, you know, everyone should have access to. Everyone should have an opportunity, access to educational opportunities, and so on. And on the other hand, people being stigmatized from their background or by their background, and which goes against the kind of the whole ethos of we're all in this together.
Yeah, which is why I'm so glad that we had you on. Thank you so
very
much,
much,
both of you. It was a great discussion.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was really interesting, especially what Dominic was saying about there not being enough people making the decisions who understand.
Absolutely.
What people like
we have an
through.
Inequalities minister. We have a minister for the North. You know, we have all these genre ministers. And yet, you know, the biggest thing of the lot, income inequality. We even have a levelling up minister who you think would be, but I think that post has now gone.
It means different things to different government.
It's a huge thing. You know, it struck me that we do these podcasts in the New Statesman offices in Hatton Garden. We're surrounded by
diamonds, literally. Yeah.
And what Dominic was saying about how our resources are all out there, and yet for some reason we're not distributing them fairly enough. Adrienne was saying all the statistics and plans and things are out there showing that wealth inequality actually is bad for the economy. And I did think, have we stressed that enough? You know, are people aware of that? Should we be doing more to kind of outline what effect it has on the economy and why actually it makes good economic sense to reduce wealth inequality? Maybe we're just assuming that people know this, whereas in fact, and that it's blindingly obvious, but maybe actually we haven't done enough to articulate that.
Well, yes, clearly the sort of moral failings of the situation aren't enough to get through to the government that we have at the moment. So maybe that argument about how it actually holds back growth would be more productive.
Exactly.
And actually, you know, what Adrienne was saying about there being, you know, us basically being a poor society with a few rich people living in it, that's bad for growth, because if you put universal credit up, which this government is very reluctant to do, then those people will spend their money. Whereas if you give more money to the rich, then they save it or they put it in assets, and it doesn't trickle down as is supposed to be the way. Yes. And actually, Adrienne mentioned that we sort of don't compare well to some so-called developing countries. I was looking this up, and the average UK household is actually 20% worse off than its equivalent in northwestern Europe. But even in Eastern Europe, some countries are pulling away from us. So the average Slovenian household will be better off than its British counterpart by 2024. No offence to Slovenia, but that's not something that I think sort of British politicians would necessarily want to be the case. But that's where we're heading. I'd love to know what you think about what our guests have said. Is the government doing enough to close the equality gap? Let us know in the comments. In the last season of Westminster Reimagined, Armando and I had a really interesting discussion about whether it's politicians or activists who really make change happen in society. We spoke to the Clean Air campaigner, Rosamund Adukisi Deborah, and city trader turned philanthropist Gary Stevenson. You can watch this by clicking the link on the screen now. And subscribe to The New Statesman on YouTube for more videos discussing British politics.